By mid-1944, the Pacific had turned into a brutal chessboard of attrition. The tide that once carried Japan's empire across half the ocean was now receding, violently. After Pearl Harbor and early victories in the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, Japan's momentum was broken at Midway in 1942 and ground down at Guadalcanal the following year. Now, the United States was advancing methodically, island by island, but a campaign of airstrips, coral, and blood. The goal was clear: move close enough to Japan's homeland to bomb its cities and strangle its ability to fight. And the next critical step on that path lay in the Mariana Islands, a small chain of volcanic landmasses stretching across the central Pacific. Among them stood Saipan, 23 kilometers long, 8 wide. A tiny speck on the map, but one of immense strategic value. From Saipan, the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers could finally reach Tokyo. If the U.S. captured it, Japan's inner defense ring would be breached, and the emperor's capital would lie within striking distance. The Japanese high command understood that reality. So did every soldier stationed there. That's why, when the U.S. invasion began on June 15, 1944, Saipan became more than a battlefield. It became a symbol of national survival. The Americans landed with overwhelming strength. Over 71,000 troops from the U.S. 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, later joined by the 27th Infantry Division. Offshore, the most powerful naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific rained shells upon the island. Battleships, cruisers, and carriers turned the coastline into smoke and shattered coral. But despite the bombardment, resistance was fanatical. Japanese troops, and about 32,000 strong under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, had transformed the island into a fortress. Cave networks, ridges, and sugarcane fields became defensive traps. Every inch of ground had to be earned. The battle raged for weeks. U.S. Marines clawed their way inland under machine gun fire, while Japanese defenders counterattacked with mortars and suicide charges. Civilian homes became bunkers. Hillsides turned into mass graves. For the Japanese, there was no retreat, only delay. For the Americans, there was no choice but to push forward. The closer they came to Saipan's northern ridges, the more desperate the defenders became. By early July, Japanese forces were shattered but not broken. Ammunition was nearly gone. Food and water were exhausted. Yet to surrender was unthinkable. The Code of Bushido, the Imperial Army's soul, forbade it. In his final message, General Saito wrote that the time had come for his men to make the ultimate sacrifice, to die with honor. His plan was terrifying in its simplicity: gather every remaining soldier, wounded or not, and launch a single, overwhelming Banzai charge, a human wave designed to crush the enemy or perish trying. What few outside the command bunker knew was that Saito's order wouldn't only involve soldiers. Many civilians armed with little more than rifles, grenades, or sticks were compelled to join. They too were told to die for the emperor, and among those swept into the chaos was a man who had never worn a uniform, never held command, and never expected to face a battlefield. He stood at the edge of history, about to play a role that no one could have predicted. As the night before the final charge fell over Saipan, fires glowed across the ridges and the sound of distant chanting echoed through the shattered island. It was the calm before a storm, unlike any other in the Pacific War. The night before the final assault, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito gathered his remaining officers in a cave near the northern cliffs of Saipan. His face, pale and gaunt, reflected the exhaustion of a lost cause. The island's defenses had collapsed, supply lines were cut, and communication with Tokyo was gone. Outside, the sound of waves broke against the coral, steady and indifferent to human suffering. Saito knew the end had come, but surrender was not an option. In his final message sent by radio to Imperial headquarters, he wrote, "The fate of the Empire depends upon the decisive battle in the Mariana Islands. Each man will kill 10 of the enemy before dying." He ended the message with a request for the Emperor's forgiveness. Then he prepared his final order, a gyokusai, an honorable death charge, where every able-bodied man was to die attacking rather than surrendering. This doctrine was rooted in Japan's wartime ideology, the Bushido Code, the samurai's creed of loyalty and death before dishonor. By 1944, it had become national dogma. Soldiers were told that dying for the emperor was the highest virtue. Living in defeat was shame. On Saipan, that belief would claim not just soldiers, but civilians, farmers, laborers, and even women forced into service. Among the defenders were roughly 4,000 civilian auxiliaries, many brought from Japan or Okinawa to work in agriculture or construction. When the army situation grew hopeless, these civilians were armed with whatever could be found: captured rifles, grenades, bamboo spears, even tools. Some volunteered. Others had no choice. The island's terrain turned into a vast graveyard of defiance. Caves became command posts. Sugarcane fields turned to ambush zones. Wounded soldiers crawled out from tunnels to die in the open, determined to take someone with them. On the American side, the mood was grim. The 105th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 27th Division had taken heavy casualties. Their lines stretched thin across the island's northern plain, a patchwork of foxholes and sandbag emplacements under the rising sun. Many soldiers were exhausted, some wounded, others low on ammunition. They had been fighting continuously for more than 3 weeks. What they didn't know was that thousands of Japanese troops were gathering in the darkness just beyond the ridge. Around 3,000 men, the remnants of the Imperial garrison, were forming ranks for a final suicidal attack. Some were officers in tattered uniforms. Others were civilians in work clothes, bandaged, barefoot, carrying swords, bayonets, or even sticks. At dawn, Saito's words echoed through the ranks. "Let us show the spirit of the Japanese army. May our deaths bring honor to the Emperor." Moments later, he committed ritual suicide, seppuku, inside his bunker. His officers followed. Outside, the roar of the human wave began. The Banzai charge of Saipan, the largest in the Pacific War, would soon crash into the American lines with terrifying force. It would sweep over tanks, trenches, and gun nests in a tidal wave of death and desperation. And in that chaos, on the edge of the broken defensive line, stood a man who wasn't supposed to be part of the story. A civilian, armed with a light rifle meant for self-defense. Not war. His weapon, the M1 carbine, had been mocked by many frontline troops as too small, too light, not a real rifle. Yet on this morning, it would prove its worth beyond imagination. As the first cries of Tenno Heika Banzai rolled down from the ridges and the ground began to shake under thousands of charging feet, history turned its gaze toward one forgotten figure and one underestimated weapon. The island was about to erupt in one of the most desperate and unforgettable clashes of the entire Pacific campaign when the first light of June 7th cut through the haze. The world on Saipan shifted from silence to madness. The Japanese charge had begun, a roaring storm of bodies, steel, and voices. To understand what happened next, we must see this moment from several angles: tactical, technological, and human, layers that defined not just the battle, but the meaning of courage itself. The Japanese Banzai charge was more than a scream and rush. It was an act of organized chaos, fueled by desperation and doctrine. Traditionally, it aimed to shock and overwhelm, breaking through superior firepower by sheer numbers and spirit. On Saipan, it became the largest such charge ever recorded in the Pacific. Nearly 3,000 men moving as one. They assembled in waves, officers in front followed by infantry, wounded soldiers, and behind them, unarmed laborers and civilians pressed into the line. There were no flanking maneuvers, no retreat paths, only forward. They advanced across the cane fields shouting "Banzai" until their throats tore, hoping to drown out the fear. The American front was held mainly by the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the U.S. 105th Infantry Regiment. Their defenses were stretched across an open plain, anchored by machine guns, mortars, and a few Sherman tanks. But many of those tanks were out of position or disabled. The line wasn't built to stop thousands, only small counterattacks. As the charge came closer, the Americans opened fire. Machine guns ripped through the front ranks, but the mass kept coming. The sheer number of attackers created a terrifying sight. Human waves cresting over the bodies of their fallen comrades, pushing through bullets, smoke, and blood. Within minutes, the Japanese broke through the first line of foxholes. Hand-to-hand combat erupted. Bayonets clashed, grenades exploded inside trenches, and the air filled with screams in both languages. Soldiers fought until their rifles jammed, then used them as clubs. It was no longer a battle of tactics. It was survival. In this inferno stood the weapon many soldiers had once ridiculed, the M1 carbine. Issued as a lightweight rifle for officers, engineers, and support troops, the M1 carbine fired a smaller .30 caliber round, less powerful than the M1 Garand's .30-06 cartridge. At just 5.8 pounds, it was half the weight of a full infantry rifle. Its size made it easy to carry but often led to scorn. Too weak for war, many said. But that morning on Saipan, its agility and rate of fire would become its greatest strength. In the confusion of the Banzai charge, close quarters fighting erupted across trenches and defensive points. Soldiers didn't have time to reload heavy rifles or reposition long barrels. The carbine's light frame allowed rapid, precise fire, perfect for short distances and fast reaction. The civilian who wielded it wasn't trained for battlefield marksmanship, but he didn't need to be. The M1 carbine was intuitive, semi-automatic, and capable of firing 15 rounds in seconds. Each pull of the trigger spat a muzzle flash through the dawn fog. The recoil was light, allowing quick aim shot after shot. The sound of the carbine's crack was distinct, faster, higher pitched than the thunder of the Garands and machine guns. It was never designed to stop tanks or distant enemies. It was built for moments like this, chaos at arm's length, when reaction time mattered more than raw power. In that maelstrom, this so-called too-small weapon turned into a lifeline. Somewhere along the northern ridge, amid broken sandbags and bodies, a civilian contractor, likely an American laborer or local island worker attached to a support unit, found himself cut off. He had taken shelter near a disabled U.S. Jeep when the charge began. Around him lay the wounded, the dead, and an abandoned crate of carbine magazines. When the first Japanese soldiers broke through the perimeter, instinct took over. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't supposed to be there. But war doesn't ask permission. He grabbed an M1 carbine from a fallen trooper, slammed a magazine in, and crouched behind the Jeep. The noise was unbearable. A chorus of battle cries, gunfire, and explosions so close that the ground vibrated with each step of the oncoming charge. When the first figures emerged through the smoke, he fired. One shot, then another. The weapon kicked lightly in his hands. The nearest attacker fell. Then another. Then 5. He kept firing on fast, controlled bursts, using every second of advantage before they closed the distance. Each reload was frantic. His hands trembled, but his aim stayed true. At that moment, he wasn't thinking about courage, history, or survival. Only rhythm. Fire, breathe, reload, repeat. When American reinforcements later reached that section, they found hundreds of Japanese bodies scattered across the cane field, and a single man, covered in dust and blood, his carbine barrel smoking. The underestimated weapon, and the untrained man behind it, had held a gap that could have collapsed the entire flank, and the battle was far from over. The battle for Saipan was not just a clash of arms, it was a collision of cultures, convictions, and desperation. The human, psychological, and leadership angles of this moment expose the deeper truths behind the roar of gunfire. Truths about fear, loyalty, and the fragile line between duty and survival. The tragedy of Saipan was that its soil was soaked not only with soldiers' blood, but with that of civilians. Thousands of them, many of whom had never wanted to be part of the war. When the Japanese Empire colonized the Marianas decades earlier, it brought settlers, workers, and their families. They built farms, schools, and homes. By 1944, these civilians were trapped in a nightmare. As the Americans advanced, Japanese propaganda warned them that capture meant torture or death. They were told the Americans were monsters. And when the Imperial Command ordered the final Yokusai, those same civilians were handed weapons and sent into the charge. Some obeyed. Others hid. And a few, including the civilian at the heart of this story, found themselves in the middle of the battlefield, neither soldier nor bystander. His decision to fight wasn't born of orders or ideology. It was instinct, to live, to protect the wounded around him, to do something in the face of chaos. In that sense, he represented an overlooked truth of war. That courage often comes from those who were never trained to have it. To the Americans, the Banzai charge was madness, suicidal fury that defied logic. But to the Japanese, it was the ultimate expression of Bushido, the warrior's way. In the face of certain defeat, they sought meaning through death. For soldiers raised in a culture that glorified sacrifice, Dying with honor was not tragedy. It was transcendence. The emperor was seen as divine. To die for him was to achieve immortality. That belief transformed ordinary men into weapons of willpower. On Saipan, however, that doctrine met the industrial efficiency of American firepower. Machine guns, flamethrowers, and mortars that made heroism obsolete. The Banzai charge became not a victory, but a collective suicide. The Americans watching it unfold were shaken. Some described it as a nightmare come alive. Others spoke of men charging through bullets like ghosts who didn't know they were dead yet. It was chaos beyond reason, and yet, behind it lay a clarity of belief that only desperation could produce. For the men defending that line, the sight left scars that would last a lifetime. Many later said that nothing in the war compared to that morning. Even veterans of Normandy and Peleliu described Saipan's charge as something primal, a moment when war stopped being strategy and became pure survival. In the American ranks, leadership was tested to its breaking point. Officers like Colonel Gerard W. Kelly of the 105th Infantry tried to rally scattered troops as the human wave struck. Radio communication was overwhelmed by panic and static. Many platoons fought in isolation, cut off and surrounded. In such moments, leadership was no longer about orders. It was about example. Some officers died standing atop their foxholes, shouting for their men to hold the line. Others crawled between positions under fire, coordinating what little resistance remained. The civilians' stand with the M1 carbine may never have been part of any command plan, but it embodied the same leadership spirit, the refusal to yield when reason said to run. His courage wasn't strategic. It was contagious. In the aftermath, several soldiers recalled how that section's unexpected resistance helped them rally and close the gap before the enemy overran the flank. On the Japanese side, leadership had dissolved into fatalism. With Saito's death, command passed to Colonel Ikeda, who continued to lead the charge until he too fell in combat. Discipline collapsed into frenzy. Officers who survived their own attacks often turned their pistols on themselves. By the time the sun rose fully over the island, there were no leaders left, only echoes of devotion and despair. In retrospect, the Banzai charge at Saipan stands as both a testament to courage and a symbol of its misuse. The Japanese soldiers fought with unquestionable bravery, but it was bravery bound by delusion, guided by a system that demanded death instead of survival. For the Americans, victory came with guilt. Many of the dead were civilians or wounded men forced into the assault. After the smoke cleared, survivors described seeing mothers clutching empty rifles, teenage boys in work clothes, and the shattered remains of a people convinced that surrender was worse than annihilation. The moral weight of that morning would haunt those who witnessed it. It forced a reckoning, not just about tactics, but about the nature of belief, leadership, and humanity under the pressure of ideology. The Banzai charge ended as it began, in silence. The field that once thundered with war cries was now still, covered in smoke and bodies. And amid that ruin stood the survivor with the small rifle, his weapon empty, his mind unable to comprehend what had just passed. But history wasn't finished with him yet. Because what followed, the turning point, and would decide not just Saipan's fate, but Japan's future in the war. Dawn bled into the battlefield like fire over smoke. The mist lifted, revealing what the Americans had only heard in the darkness, a wall of men screaming, charging, unstoppable. It was 6 a.m., June 7, 1944. The largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War had begun. The Japanese force, nearly 3,000 strong, swept down from the hills in a mass that seemed endless. They came from caves, ridges, and ravines, surging toward the American positions of the 105th Infantry Regiment. Many were barefoot, bloodied, and bandaged, yet their cries of "Tanoheka Banzai" rolled across the plain like thunder. The Americans, spread thin across a half-mile defensive line, had no time to regroup. Machine guns rattled to life, mowing down the front ranks, but the wave didn't stop. Every man behind the first row kept running, stepping over the dead, firing wildly, swinging bayonets. From his position near a disabled jeep, the civilian with the M1 carbine watched the chaos unfold. Smoke and dust obscured the field. The air stank of cordite and blood. Around him, wounded soldiers tried to reload, shouting orders that were drowned out by the roar of the charge. He raised his rifle. The first Japanese soldier appeared through the smoke, uniform shredded, eyes wild, bayonet glinting in the light. The carbine barked once, twice. The man fell. Another followed. Then 3 more. The rifle cracked rhythmically, its recoil pushing lightly against his shoulder. A shell exploded nearby, showering dirt and debris. The ground shook violently. For a moment he couldn't hear anything, just the ringing in his ears and the muffled thump of boots approaching. When the sound returned, it came as a terrifying chorus of battle cries closing in. He ducked behind the jeep, reloaded, and fired again. The .30 caliber rounds tore through the dust, dropping figures one by one. He could feel the heat of the weapon in his hands. Each magazine lasted only seconds. To his left, a machine gun position went silent and overrun. The line was breaking. American soldiers were retreating toward secondary positions, trying to regroup near a cluster of tanks and artillery. For a few minutes, the only resistance on that section of the line came from this lone point, a man firing a too small weapon against a tidal wave of fury. Then, from the rear, the Americans rallied. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien, commanding the 1st Battalion, personally manned a machine gun after his crew was killed. He fired until he was shot dead atop his position, refusing to retreat. Nearby, Captain Ben L. Salomon, a dentist turned field surgeon, grabbed a rifle from a fallen soldier and fought off dozens of attackers to protect the wounded in his aid station. He was later found surrounded by 98 enemy bodies. The battlefield dissolved into a single, continuous melee. Grenades burst in every direction. Men fought with knives, bayonets, entrenching tools on anything that could kill. Japanese soldiers leapt into foxholes, slashing at defenders before being shot or bayoneted in turn. The Americans, though shocked and outnumbered, held on by inches. The civilian fired until his last magazine ran dry. He reached for another, empty. Around him, the dead formed a wall. The carbine clicked uselessly. For a moment, he thought it was over. Then he spotted a fallen soldier's pack nearby, half buried under debris. Inside 2 more magazines, he reloaded and kept firing. Each shot was a heartbeat. Each enemy that fell gave the men around him another second to live. Slowly, the wave began to falter. The first 1,000 attackers were dead. The second 1,000 stumbled over their bodies, disorganized, exhausted. Still, they came. But the volume of American fire was growing again, rifles, machine guns, and mortars finding their rhythm. The line was stabilizing. By 7:30 a.m., the once roaring charge had turned into isolated pockets of resistance. Small groups of Japanese soldiers broke through but found themselves trapped and annihilated by crossfire. Others reached the American medical tents and slaughtered the wounded before being shot down themselves. The civilian kept fighting until the rifle jammed from heat. He cleared it, breathing hard, his hands shaking. Vision blurred from smoke and tears. When the last attacker fell within sight, he lowered the weapon, only to hear new shouting behind the ridge. Another wave was coming. Smaller but still deadly. He took position again. The carbine pressed to his shoulder, waiting for the figures to appear through the rising smoke. These, second charge would decide everything, whether Saipan held or fell. The smoke had barely settled when a new sound rippled across the hills, the beating of boots, the guttural cries, the clash of metal against stone. The second Banzai wave was coming, smaller than the first but no less furious. About 1,000 men, remnants of shattered units, regrouped for one final assault. They knew they wouldn't survive, but to them death was no longer a thing to fear. It was duty. The code of Bushido demanded it. To live after defeat was shame. To die with defiance was honor. As the charge began, the Americans were still reeling. Smoke obscured visibility. Communication lines were down, and many officers were dead or wounded. The front line had dissolved into a patchwork of foxholes, debris, and cratered earth, a graveyard masquerading as a defensive position. From his battered post behind the burned-out jeep, the civilian with the M1 carbine steadied himself once more. The rifle's metal was hot, its barrel blackened. His fingers trembled as he reloaded. Around him lay more than 100 bodies, American and Japanese, tangled together in grotesque silence. He muttered under his breath. Not a prayer, not a curse, but something between the two. Then the horizon erupted again. The Japanese came screaming, bayonets glinting, grenades in hand. The civilian fired. The carbine answered like a heartbeat, pop, pop, pop. Each burst of flame from the muzzle cut through the haze. Each shot another desperate claim to survive. To his right, a group of GIs tried to hold a trench, but a mortar shell landed among them, erasing the position in an instant. The shockwave lifted him off the ground, throwing dirt into his mouth and eyes. He spat, wiped his face, and kept firing. He could hear shouts behind him, a sergeant yelling for reinforcements, medics dragging the wounded to cover. One man screamed for ammo, another for water. Chaos was everywhere, yet somehow the line didn't break. Then a sharp click, empty again. He reached for another magazine. Gone. He checked his belt, his pockets, nothing. The carbine was dry. The only sound left was the drumming of approaching feet and the hammering of his heart. A Japanese soldier charged directly toward him, rifle raised, bayonet forward. The civilian swung the carbine like a club, smashing the attacker in the face, breaking the rifle stock in half. He grabbed the man's bayonet and drove it forward, instinct, not thought. Another came. He ducked, rolled, picked up a fallen Thompson submachine gun and opened fire. The gun kicked violently in his hands, tracers ripping through the enemy line. He held the trigger down until it clicked dry, until smoke poured from the barrel. When the gun jammed, he dropped it and grabbed another weapon from a fallen Marine, an M1 Garand this time. He didn't care about calibers or tactics. He just fired. Over and over. Each weapon became an extension of his will to survive. The Japanese ranks thinned. The assault faltered. Mortars from the rear began finding their targets, tearing gaps through the charge. American machine guns roared again, Browning 30 cal stitching the field with death. By 8:15 a.m., the second wave was crumbling. Those who reached the American positions fought hand to hand. Men stabbed, clawed, bit, reduced to the rawest form of combat. One Japanese officer, his uniform shredded, drew his katana and charged straight into a machine gun nest. He was cut down before reaching it, but others followed him anyway. The civilian found himself face to face with a final attacker, a young soldier, maybe 17, trembling, bleeding, yet still raising his rifle. For a heartbeat, they both froze. Two men on opposite sides of a nightmare, staring across the smoke. Then the Japanese boy lunged. The carbine cracked one last time. Silence followed. It was over. For the first time in hours, there was no screaming, no gunfire, only the wind moving over the dead. The civilian lowered the rifle and looked around. The battlefield of Saipan was a vision of hell. Bodies stacked in mounds, weapons scattered like bones, smoke curling from the ground. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay where they had fallen. Among them, hundreds of Americans. Still, silent, unrecognizable. He had fired nearly 15 magazines through that little rifle. Over 200 rounds. And somehow, through all of it, he was still standing. When reinforcements arrived minutes later, they found him leaning against the jeep, his uniform shredded, his face blackened by soot. He didn't say a word. He just nodded once, eyes fixed on the smoking horizon. The Banzai charge of Saipan, the largest of the war, had been broken. Nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers had died in less than 2 hours. The American line held, but at a terrible cost. That morning, the legend of the civilian with the carbine began to spread. Some said he wasn't even supposed to be there. Others claimed he killed more men than anyone in his unit. No one knew his name. Only that when the line broke, he stood. And in the end, that was all that mattered. When the guns finally fell silent, the island of Saipan was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. The largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War had ended in blood and smoke. By the time the sun rose high above the shattered ridges, over 4,300 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Hundreds more were wounded, crawling through the brush or hiding among the bodies, waiting for the inevitable. For the Americans, the cost was staggering. Nearly 650 men from the 105th Infantry Regiment were killed or wounded in just a few hours. Entire companies were gone, names erased from rosters that morning. The survivors wandered the wreckage in silence, too numb to speak, their uniforms torn, their rifles empty, their eyes hollow. Medics moved carefully among the fallen, tagging the living and covering the dead. Bulldozers arrived by noon, clearing the field to make way for burial details. The tropical air was heavy with the smell of cordite, sweat, and decay. For many soldiers, it was the first time they had seen death on such a scale. A wave of humanity destroyed in one act of desperation. And yet, Within that chaos, one small rifle began to symbolize something far larger, the M1 carbine, the lightweight semi-automatic weapon often criticized for its limited stopping power, had proven its worth in the most brutal conditions imaginable. Soldiers who once called it the toy gun now spoke of it with quiet respect. In the hands of infantrymen, engineers, and even non-combatants, it had saved lives. It was light, fast, and precise, a weapon made not for heroes but for survivors. The civilian who had wielded it that morning was later identified as a technician attached to the 105th Infantry. He had been ordered to remain in the rear, but when the Banzai charge hit, he refused to retreat. His position was overrun twice. He fought until every round was spent. When the battle ended, he was found still gripping the carbine, his fingers locked around the trigger guard. He never gave an interview. He never claimed credit. His name was buried in after-action reports, a footnote in a war filled with giants. But those who were there remembered him. They remembered the sound of his rifle cutting through the storm, the sight of one man holding the line when the world seemed to collapse. As the Army compiled its reports, the full picture of the battle emerged. Intelligence estimated that between 3,000 and 4,000 Japanese troops had participated in the charge, including wounded men pulled from field hospitals. Many had no rifles, some carried bamboo spears, others hand grenades, and a few simply advanced with swords or empty hands. It was not a tactical maneuver. It was mass suicide, the final expression of an empire's dying code. For the Americans, the attack was both terrifying and tragic. Officers reported that several Japanese soldiers, after being shot, still tried to crawl forward. Others blew themselves up with grenades rather than surrender. The enemy was not fighting for ground. They were fighting for an ideal, a death that promised redemption. In the official U.S. Army history, the event was recorded as the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific Campaign, a moment when the old world of warrior honor collided with the modern reality of mechanized war. And in that collision, both sides bled. As the last bodies were collected and the fires burned out, Saipan became a symbol, not of glory, but of the futility of absolute devotion. The Japanese Empire had spent its human spirit in one final, impossible act. And the Americans had seen, perhaps for the first time, just how far their enemy was willing to go. But even as the war raged on, one lesson would linger. Courage was not the property of nations or armies. It could come from anywhere, even from a civilian with a rifle too small for war. In the days that followed, the U.S. military secured Saipan completely. The Japanese resistance had been annihilated, but victory carried a dark weight. The Battle of Saipan cost the United States more than 14,000 casualties, with over 3,400 dead. For Japan, the numbers were catastrophic. More than 29,000 soldiers killed and thousands of civilians who took their own lives rather than face capture. From a strategic standpoint, Saipan's fall was a turning point. For the first time, the Japanese home islands were within range of American B-29 bombers. The skies that once belonged to the Empire were now open highways for destruction. Tokyo could no longer pretend the war was distant. It had come to their doorstep. But beneath the grand sweep of strategy and maps, there remained the human stories, the small, quiet truths buried beneath the numbers. When the burial details reached the southern cliffs, they found scenes beyond imagination. Entire families had leapt into the sea together. Mothers clutching children, soldiers embracing one another before jumping. Leaflets had been dropped promising fair treatment to prisoners, but years of propaganda had convinced the people otherwise. Surrender meant torture and dishonor. So they chose death. American soldiers stood in silence as they watched bodies float below the cliffs. Many of them would later say that the victory felt hollow, a triumph paid for with something irreplaceable. Among those who helped with the recovery teams was the same civilian who had survived the Banzai charge. He worked quietly, refusing medical evacuation. He said little, moving through the wreckage with the same calm focus he had shown in battle. One sergeant later recalled, "He wasn't proud. He wasn't broken. He just looked empty, like he'd left something of himself out there on that field." The legend of the Carbine Man of Saipan spread quickly through the Pacific theater. He became a symbol, not of military glory, but of resilience, of ordinary men forced into extraordinary moments. Commanders cited his example in morale speeches. Weapon designers back in the States used it to argue for the M1 carbine's continued production. The weapon itself became an icon of adaptability, a bridge between the full-sized M1 Garand and the submachine guns. It was light enough for clerks, medics, and radio men to carry, yet strong enough to defend against a charge of thousands. In the chaotic warfare of the Pacific, that mattered. Reports of similar acts of bravery began to surface from other islands, Guam, Palau, and later Okinawa. Men who were never meant to fight had taken up arms and stood their ground. The war had blurred every boundary, between soldier and civilian, between duty and survival. For the Japanese military, the Saipan Banzai charge was both a tragedy and a prophecy. The emperor's forces had proven their willingness to die to the last man, but they had also exposed the futility of such sacrifice. After Saipan, the imperial army could no longer hide the truth from itself. The tide of war had turned irreversibly. Even so, similar last stands would repeat, on Leyte, on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa. Each one smaller, more desperate, more hollow. The code of Bushido had been weaponized beyond reason, consuming the very people it was meant to honor. And yet, in the ruins of that belief, moments of shared humanity persisted. American medics treated Japanese wounded. Japanese soldiers, once fanatical, surrendered in tears when offered water. The world was beginning to glimpse the exhaustion beneath the myth, the human breaking point of total war. For historians, Saipan remains one of the most defining moments of the Pacific Campaign, not simply for its military consequence, but for what it revealed about both sides. The clash between faith and firepower, between tradition and technology, between men who wanted to die and men who had no choice but to survive. And through it all, one small rifle, underestimated, overlooked, became the voice of survival amid madness. When historians speak of Saipan, they often describe it in terms of numbers: battalions lost, ships sunk, miles gained. But beneath those statistics lies a deeper truth, one written not on maps, but in memory. The Banzai charge of June 1944 was not just the largest of the Pacific War, it was the end of an idea that loyalty could outweigh logic, that death could serve as victory. For Japan, it marked the shattering of Bushido's illusion in the face of modern war. For America, it was a grim lesson that courage and fanaticism can look the same in the smoke of battle, until you count the bodies. And within that storm, a single figure stood as quiet proof of something timeless. A man without rank, without orders, holding a weapon deemed too weak for real war. And yet, in that hour, it was enough. His fight was not about honor or empire. It was about the simplest truth of all, to live when everything else dies. The M1 carbine, the small gun, became more than a tool. It became a symbol of endurance. It reminded the soldiers that survival itself could be an act of defiance, that sometimes the smallest weapon in the hands of a determined man could stop an army built on death. As the war moved onward, through the fires of Iwo Jima, across the cliffs of Okinawa, and finally to Hiroshima's blinding end, the echoes of Saipan lingered. Every charge, every desperate last stand seemed to carry its shadow. It was there in that broken field of coral and blood that two worlds collided, the old and the new, the myth and the man. History remembers generals and emperors, but it also remembers moments like this, when a single civilian, armed with what others dismissed, held his ground against 3,000, not for glory, not for fame, but because survival, in its quietest form, is its own kind of victory.